All right, let's start. And for a moment, let's talk about next week's midterm. Right here, unless you're a DSP student, you'll get a separate notification about where that exam will be. Try to be here next week by 10:05 so we can start passing out the exams, give you as much time as possible. You've seen sample midterm questions posted on BSpace. Multiple choice, fill in, compare and contrast a couple terms, a paragraph each, and a choice of a 15 or so minute essay question. So there's a variety of formats. You'll have to work quickly but not rush. When you do your essay, spend 2 minutes and write a little outline first so you get organized, so you don't just start rushing and saying, oh my God, I'm saying the wrong thing. There's a review session run by your GSIs this coming Monday at 4 o'clock, and the room will be announced as soon as the room is found on BSpace, right? And bring a pen, not a pencil to the midterm, no Scantron, no blue book, you'll just write on the pages we give you. Questions on the midterm. So today, we're going to start in on disorders, or actually syndromes, because as we talked about, there's no disorders in the DSM. There's no unified cause that's been found for any of the conditions we'll talk about. And our goal is, with the previous weeks of all of our background chalk talk, models, what is mental illness, are things on a continuum or the actual categories, risk factors, protective factors, temperament, attachment, families, peers, genes, gene by environment, interactions, gene-environment correlations, all the way to neighborhoods and throughout transactional processes. You'll be hearing as we talk about ADHD and conduct problems and autism and learning problems, all of these themes. So the idea is not just to memorize facts about conditions, but to try to understand how they might have originated, how they develop, and we'll do a little bit of treatment for each, but not too much. So ADHD has been called many things over the years. It used to be called, in the first half of the last century, MBD, minimal brain dysfunction. And there's a long story as to why, but it mainly has to do with, near the end of World War I, there was a worldwide epidemic of influenza that killed 60 million people. Survivors of that terrible flu often had inattention and impulsivity and hyperactivity and learning problems that they didn't before. And then post-mortem, people realized that that virus attacked the brain. So here's an example of a known pathogen in the brain causing these symptoms. But what doctors did was made a classic error in causal reasoning called modus tollens, which is, okay, if we know in some cases there's a cause and we see the symptoms, if we see the symptoms, therefore there must be a pathogen in the brain, which isn't necessarily the case if you studied logic at all. But the name stuck. Well, it's a brain damage syndrome. Well, we don't know if there's a real cause. It's minimal brain damage, minimal brain dysfunction, which gave way to hyperkinesis or hyperactivity, which in 1980 gave way to the term attention deficit disorder, which gave way to, 7 years later, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. If you're confused by this, so am I, and so is everybody in the field. It's really confusing as to why the name has changed so much. So DSM-5, which promised big changes over DSM-4, in the ADHD world didn't really change much of anything at all, with one exception we'll talk about. All the factor analytic studies show that there's really 2 branches of problems or symptoms. So here's the inattentive symptoms. I'm not going to read each one. What do you think of? Well, maybe a kid just doesn't friggin' care. Or maybe these are kids who are kind of immature and don't pay attention in school the way they should. Or maybe, in some of these symptoms, maybe these are a result of a hearing problem. Or maybe there's a deeper language processing problem. Or maybe some kids who are abused and traumatized might be spacey and forgetful and dissociative. Or if you're getting the sense that there's a lot of origins to these problems, you're right. What would that be called? Equifinality. There may be many pathways that converge on this list of symptoms. The DSM says if you've got a majority, if you've got at least 6 of these, pretty extreme, then you might have this thing called ADHD, at least the inattentive form of it. Then there's 9 other symptoms that really demarcate kids who are too active or too impulsive or both. Maybe these are just kids with a very active temperament grown older. Maybe some of these kids have been traumatized. Maybe some of these kids live in very chaotic environments and they're running around because they've never had any authoritative parenting. Or maybe, same thing. A lot of different pathways by which a kid might show a lot of these impulsive and hyperactive symptoms. And again, the DSM says, look, if you've got at least 6 of them and they're pretty severe, you might have the form of ADHD called the hyperactive impulsive variety. Most kids who get referred have what? They've got a lot of inattention and they've got a lot of hyperactive impulsive symptoms. So they're in what's called the combined, used to be called a type, now presentation or form. They've got a combination of inattention and hyperactivity and impulsivity. But just having those symptoms, does that mean you've got a disorder called ADHD? No, it means you've got a syndrome, but there might be many, many pathways that led you there, which is one of the big problems of the DSM. It's like you've got the symptoms, you must have ADHD. But as we know from our previous 5.5 weeks of lectures and reading, it's not that simple. What's one thing, again, about these symptoms? If you've got a lot of these symptoms, you're kind of acting like a 3-year-old boy. Because most 3-year-old boys in the United States and anywhere have ADHD. Because why? Because they're 3 years older than they're boys. Boys' brains are slow to develop. Girls are chatting away in full sentences in preschool, and the boys are running through, disrupting activities and grunting and trying to cause havoc. Boys take a lot longer to develop. So maybe some people have said ADHD is a kind of immaturity. It takes the boys a lot longer to catch up and get with the program, socially, emotionally, behaviorally. This is a syndrome. Everything in DSM is a syndrome. Most studies diagnose ADHD how? The statistical model. You give a parent or a teacher, or preferably both, a checklist of these symptoms we just looked at, and they might rate them on, oh, this kid never displays them, oh, a little, yeah, a lot, oh my God, all the time. And if the majority of those symptoms occur most or all the time for the kids, well, above the 90th or 95th percentile, that's ADHD. So most studies define ADHD through how? The statistical model. You've got a lot of these symptoms relative to the rest of the population. Just how we define high blood pressure. You've got more systolic and diastolic points than the average. You're way more than the average. But what's the problem with the statistical model from way back in, what was it, the second lecture or so? How much is too much? What about the 75th percentile? Those kids have problems. Or no, we don't want to diagnose until it's really 99th percentile. But then we miss a lot of kids who aren't learning. There's no magic place along which, aha, you've got high blood pressure, but you don't. You've got ADHD and you don't. So the statistical model can be arbitrary. Wouldn't it be great if we didn't have to rely on parent and teacher checklists? We had some objective test. You sit in front of a computer, and it measures how well you're focusing on the material. Or we, in the olden days, you'd have to wear kind of a little backpack almost. Now you can wear a wristwatch that measures how much you move. It's called an actigraph. So maybe we can measure hyperactivity objectively. How much fidgeting and squirming does a kid actually do? What's the problem? When you get a parent or teacher to do the ratings, which is much more convenient, What's the correspondence with the computerized test of attention or the risk active graph? Not very good. Our objective measures aren't perfectly aligned at all with our more subjective reports. So who do you trust? You trust the parents, you trust the teachers, you trust your own acumen as a clinician, you trust the active graph, you trust the computer measure. What's the problem with computer measures? I'm sitting one-on-one in the clinician's office. I might focus fine there, but put me in a classroom with 26 other kids and I have real problems. The ecological model. Maybe you can do fine one-on-one, but you have problems fitting in with a large group. These are all the things a clinician has to consider in making the diagnosis. What about asking the kid? Let's ask Jose, let's ask Susie how many symptoms they've got. What's the problem with doing that for ADHD? Most kids with pretty severe ADHD say, I'm doing fine, but my teacher really sucks. And I'm not quite sure why my friends don't like me. There's not a lot of good self-awareness that they might be wreaking some of the havoc they do, especially with the hyperactive impulsive symptoms. Self-report is really important to diagnose what? Internalizing problems. Only the kid knows if they're suicidal. Observers may not know if the kid's pretty quiet, but observers are much better at picking out who's spacing out or who's paying attention, who's too active or who's too impulsive. So self-report, interestingly, isn't terribly helpful to diagnose ADHD. ADHD is really cool because every year we know the cause. And in 2011, we realized the cause of ADHD was SpongeBob. It's true. The study was published. New York Times had a headline about it. Professor Lillard of Virginia, a colleague of ours, a developmental psychologist, a really good one, did a cool study. She had 4-year-olds come into her lab, and they got randomly assigned to 9 minutes of a SpongeBob episode, 9 minutes of a PBS nature show, or 9 minutes of free play. And then right afterwards, her staff gave a battery of tests of executive function. Could the kids plan? Could the kids focus? And the kids who just watched SpongeBob tanked it. They weren't doing so well. I think it was Patrick. It's not clear, right? So it's an interesting study because maybe temporarily watching a wacky program like SpongeBob disorganizes you. But the headline said, now this is the cause of ADHD. Probably not. In Israel, the same year, 2011, Israel's a country, a lot of demands for performance, academically, vocationally, and the government health ministry said, you know, these medications really help your studying. You still need a prescription, but you don't need a diagnosis. If you go tell your doctor, I'm having trouble, I'm falling behind, the doctor write a prescription, and you go into your Walgreens in Tel Aviv and get your Ritalin. Diagnoses and more prescriptions of stimulants went up 76% that year in Israel. So then the government said, oh, we were kind of only kidding. You actually need a specialist to diagnose you before you get a prescription. So policy is really shifting. Should everybody take a stimulant? Everybody brings coffee, most everybody, and maybe stimulants are the same. Or should we really restrict it? So it's in the news. It's very controversial. How do most kids get diagnosed? 10 minutes in a doctor's office. What's going to happen when you go see your family says, oh my God, the teachers are not happy with our kids' behavior. Let's go see the family doctor. Family doctor listens. 10 minutes later on average, maybe 15, a prescription's written for medication with a diagnosis. What's the problem? Well, you're going to overdiagnose. Because it could be that the kid has been abused, or it could be the kid's just in a bad classroom, or it could be that the kid's really depressed. Well, it's one of the symptoms of depression. You don't concentrate very well. But the other problem is, too many doctors will say, hey, she sat there in the waiting room fine, she can't have ADHD. Or the parents say that he can play video games for 6 hours in a row. He's got really good attention. Can't be ADHD. So when the doctor focuses on your one-on-one behavior, you can underdiagnose. So the way we do it now too much, kind of a quick and dirty assessment, we're going to both get too many kids with ADHD, but we're going to miss some who really have it. The technical term, we're going to have both false positives and false negatives. We probably ought to spend a lot more time in careful assessment. And if we were teaching a course on assessment, we would talk about how you figure out who's got these symptoms and syndromes much better. So is ADHD just, oh my God, we're an intolerant society, we don't like fidgety behavior, everybody's got to be still? Or is it really, in the medical model, a real disorder with biological causes? Stay tuned, we'll talk about that. Maybe it's all about classrooms and fit. Maybe developmental psychopathology, maybe transactional processes will help us understand this. So that's kind of where we are. So there's 3 kind of types. DSM-5 made a small change and said, well, they're not really types because kids kind of change over development. So it's kind of how you look right now. Most kids refer to have both the first set of 9 symptoms, inattention, and the second. But some kids are only inattentive. They don't seem to be hyperactive at all. And other kids are really hyperactive, but they don't seem inattentive. Who's that last group? That's mainly preschoolers. Because they haven't really yet had an academic curriculum. So we haven't really seen if they're inattentive yet. So this hyperactive impulsive form of ADHD is how most 4 and 5-year-olds get diagnosed. Many of them graduate to the combined group once they start first grade. Because now the attentional demands are on. But there's something about this inattentive group. Do they really belong in the ADHD category? They've got attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, but they're not hyperactive. So they used to be called ADD, attention deficit disorder only, without the hyperactivity. Again, if you're confused by that, so am I. The names don't really help the cause. Our kids who are inattentive only, they're not only less active than other kids with ADHD, they're less active than their typically developing peers sitting in the next chair. Is this really different? Is this not just on a continuum? Are they in a separate category? There's a lot of research on this. Maybe there's a different kind of attentional network in the brain that predicts kids who are described sometimes as spacey and slow to learn and not hyperactive at all. Then other people say, well, it's a continuum. Some kids are predominantly inattentive, and they just are a symptom or two shy of the combined form. So there's a lot of controversy about this. If you go into pediatrics or clinical psychology or school psychology or social work and you work with kids, you're going to be called upon to help assess and diagnose kids with ADHD. What should you do? Well, you should spend more than 10 minutes. And you have to note a number of things. Are these symptoms really extreme for the kid's age? For a 3.5-year-old boy to have ADHD, what would you have to have? All 9 of the symptoms at the top of the chart, and maybe a 10th. Because most 3-year-old boys are pretty darn hyper. But the DSM says, shockingly, you need 6 symptoms out of the 9, whether you're 3, 13, or 93. It's ridiculous. There should be a floating set of criteria where you really need pretty much all 9 if you're a preschooler. But if you're older, fewer. And if you're a girl, one of the points of controversy is girls are less active than boys overall. So maybe you need a lower cutoff to diagnose a girl. Because girls should be appraised against other girls and boys against other boys. DSM-4 and 5 say, accurately, if you've only got these problems at home, but you're an angel in school, that ain't ADHD, kids. Maybe you've got a really authoritarian, overly permissive home. Conversely, a kid is a wreck at school, but yes, ma'am, at home, could I do more dishes? Maybe we got to look at that classroom climate. ADHD doesn't present 24/7 all the same. It fluctuates. But more often than not, there's big problems at home and big problems at school. Or if you're an adult, real problems in the workplace or in relationships. So ADHD should not just appear only in one situation. It should appear in several different contexts. In the olden days, before last May, you couldn't get a diagnosis unless you had these symptoms before you were 7. Now, that's pretty accurate for the combined type and the hyperactive impulsive type, but a lot of kids with the inattentive form, when do we start to notice their problems? Middle school. 6 different teachers a day. A locker, your combination for the locker. A backpack's really important, a binder with tabs. And kids who've sort of struggled through elementary school with good family support and whatever, middle school they fall apart. So DSM-5 says you got to have these symptoms present before you're 12. So it takes into account the 5th and 6th graders who sort of barely held it together and now they're really having problems. The symptoms have to have lasted at least 6 months. Why? Because if a family moves and you start a new school mid-year, you can look like you've got ADHD for a few weeks. Or if your family's really stressed and arguing, these symptoms can crop up. So we're trying to look for something that is not just transitory for a few weeks at a time. And how many people do you know who are pretty speedy? And they start 25 projects a week, and they actually complete 4, which is better than the 3 you started, and maybe you completed 1. They've got all the symptoms, but they're not impaired. In fact, they thrive. So by definition, they don't have ADHD. Most of the disorders in the DSM, you've got to have the symptoms, but unless the symptoms cause, what would Wakefield say in harmful impairment? They've got to cause harm. Remember, you can be born with 6 toes. That's an impairment, but so what? Maybe you got better balance. We don't call it a disorder. So you can be very active, but if you're somewhat organized and hold it together, we probably wouldn't call it a disorder. Please. Yeah, so the question is, well, yeah, they hold it together, but if we gave treatment, they would really be a superachiever. This is one of the issues in the impairment model. What kind of supports do I need to hold it together? If I eliminated some of those symptoms, I'd be doing even better. Or let's be a little conservative. We're not going to diagnose unless I'm pretty impaired. This is one of the debates. This is why mental illness, mental disorder is controversial. How many symptoms are too many, and in what context are the symptoms causing impairment? So it's one of these unanswered questions. Over here. Yeah. Yeah, so can you grow out of it? Well, 30 years ago, everybody said, even the pediatric textbooks, ADHD disappeared when you hit puberty. Because most of the fidgeting and squirming and running around symptoms do go away. But the underlying impulse control problems and inattention don't. So you can get fooled by which symptoms you're looking at. But in a lot of cases, maybe almost half, pretty severely diagnosed kids with ADHD don't seem to have it as adults. But maybe some people say if you looked closer and you really could find out what's going on in their brain, there's still some residual, but it depends on how well they adapt in their new settings. So it's a big question. Can you really outgrow ADHD? We'll probably get back to that next time, too. So I'm going to emphasize something I said a couple of minutes ago. If you're doing an assessment, you always want to get the kid involved in the assessment, not just the parents and teachers. But many of these kids will tell you, even adults with ADHD, I'm doing fine. Everybody else in the environment is really causing trouble. Maybe this is a deficit, not just of attention to what the teacher's saying or your boss is saying. Maybe it's a deficit in attention to your own behavior. Maybe it's a self-monitoring problem. We used to think 30, 40 years ago, ADHD is a white, middle-class boy phenomenon, the Dennis the Menace syndrome, Tom Sawyer. Now, just like autism, just like eating disorders, we used to think eating disorders were only white, middle-class girls. Autism is only a rich kid syndrome. That's called referral bias. Those are the only ones who'd show up to doctors' offices. Eating disorders occur across all walks of life, certainly more in girls than boys. Autism occurs in every race and every social class. ADHD too. It's not just a white middle-class boy thing anymore at all. In fact, last year, 2012 going into 2013, for the first time, rates of diagnosis in America were about equal black and white. Now, though a lot of those diagnoses are those quick 10-minute visits, maybe some kids of different ethnic groups really don't have ADHD, but they've got a cultural fit issue. But in fact, even if you do a careful assessment, ADHD is equal opportunity. What do most clinicians still think? Just like what you think if you go into Safeway and see the kid in the shopping cart and the parent upset and just bad parenting. It's easy to blame parents. That's what we did throughout most of the last century in developmental psychology. But we have to think of reciprocal models. How much of the difficult parenting you see is because the kids are pretty hard to treat, pretty hard to deal with? Or how much of the parenting in response to that causes later problems too? Maybe it's reciprocal. How prevalent is ADHD? Now there's a trick question. It depends on where you put the cutoff on the rating scales. Just like anything in the statistical model. Around the world, 5, 6, 7%. The US is about twice as much. Why is the US twice as much? Stay awake for another few minutes. We'll have some ideas. Are there really more boys than girls with ADHD? Yes. There's more boys than girls with autism. There's more boys than girls with aggressive conduct problems. There's more boys than girls with Tourette's disorder, the tic-like behaviors that get very chronic. The first 10 years of life are the risk period for boys. Sorry, guys, our brains are slower to develop. It takes us longer to get empathic. It takes us longer to talk. It takes us longer to get socialized. But the second 10 years of life are the risk period for girls. Cutting, eating disorders, anxiety, depression, which we'll talk about explicitly in a few weeks. Is there more ADHD than before? Yeah, because we didn't even have a name for it before. But when did it really get popular as a diagnosis? About 20 years ago in the early 90s. When for the first time, under the new federal guidelines, they started in the 70s and they were redone in 1991, the federal guidelines for the first time said, hey, guess what? You can get special ed with the diagnosis of ADHD. Before they said you could get special ed, well, you had to have a learning disability, and they didn't mention ADHD explicitly. Once they did, in 1991, within 3 years, the rates of ADHD